Welcome, everyone. We're going to start right on time today. We are very, very fortunate to have one of the nation's leading experts in carbon capture with us today to talk a little about that topic. Roger Aines is the Chief Scientist for Energy and Homeland Security at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He leads the Carbon Initiative at Lawrence Livermore, which aims to understand and develop and implement technologies for the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so-called negative emissions technologies. He's been involved with all kinds of things at Lawrence Livermore over the years. He does have, I noticed that he does have his BA from Carleton College, and anybody from the Midwest would know what Carleton College is. It's a very, very good school in Minnesota. I went to Wisconsin, so I know of that school. And he also has his PhD from Caltech in geochemistry. So with that, I want to turn it over to Roger Aines, who can tell us all about carbon capture, which could have a significant impact on our addressing climate change, and particularly here in the Valley. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, and hello to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start today looking at really the issue of how we get to zero. How are we going to stop emitting carbon to the atmosphere and remove the excess that we may have placed there already? And that's been the focus of a major program that we have at Lawrence Livermore. Well, I mess around. This is always the difficult part of any talk for me, is getting all the screens right. There we go. So I'm going to talk about basically the options that we have for removing CO2 from California's air. And in the question and answer period, we can address some of the issues that come up with regard to how we keep from putting more into the air. But I think during the course of this, you'll see that the two are very similar. But to me, the really big task is that we've already made a mess and we need to clean it up. So you're going to hear the phrase net zero. What does that mean and why do we need it? Let me walk you through a quick version of what sort of the global carbon balance for the planet needs to be if we're going to keep from getting too hot, if we're going to hit the climate targets that we've all agreed are important. This graph shows the total carbon emissions that we expect the world to go through in the future if we basically didn't do anything particularly heroic. And we all know how bad it's already been and how much worse it will get if we follow this pathway of basically unabated emissions. Now, when we got together in Paris, we agreed that we wanted to get below 2 degrees C. In fact, most of us now think we want to get below 1.5 degrees C, but that's even harder, so I'm not going to abuse you with it today. But this red line is what we'd have to constrain our emissions to in order to get to a 2 degrees C future, in order to not warm more than 2 degrees C. And there's a really interesting point on that line. It gets to zero. There's a point where we can't be emitting any more carbon dioxide, any more greenhouse gases, if we want to hit 2 degrees C and stay there. Well, let's look at how you would, let's break this down. The first is all the stuff we know how to do in brown. This is all of the getting rid of fossil fuels, being more efficient, having full renewables, a carbon-free electricity system. This is all the technology that basically we know how to do today can get us all the emissions shown in the brown zone, but it doesn't get to zero. Why not? Why doesn't everything we can do get us there? Well, there's stuff that we simply can't deal with. There's other greenhouse gases, and there's some residual CO2. Let me quickly walk you through what those things are. The residual CO2 comes from things that are pretty obvious. Airplanes are going to be pretty hard to run on anything other than liquid fuel. Hopefully we can make that biofuel, but there are going to be other things. I like to point out that just because we don't use horses for transportation doesn't mean people don't own horses anymore. And that's going to be the same of internal combustion engines. There's always going to be some. So there's always going to be some CO2 emitted from fossil fuel use. We're going to try and diminish that as quickly as possible. But that's not the real problem. The real issue is things like this tractor, not the fuel that tractor is running on, but the fertilizer being spread off the back of it. That fertilizer, a small amount of it, turns into nitrous oxide, which is one of the worst possible greenhouse gases. A tiny amount has a huge impact. In fact, this is percent levels of the total greenhouse gas warming that we have in the planet comes from fertilizer. Are we going to live in a world without fertilizer? Not with 8 billion people, we're not going to. So this is the kind of thing that's just really hard to imagine ever going away. And of course, are we going to stop eating meat? Some people argue that we should, but I don't think that's going to happen. So the methane emissions from these cattle are going to continue as well. These are things that we're going to have to account for into the future. Even if we do all the renewables and all the fossil fuel removals that we can, we're still going to have those emissions, but we still have to get to zero. So how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to have to subtract carbon dioxide from the air in order to make the math work. It's simple math. If we have a positive number, we need to make a negative number to balance it out to zero. And these are called negative emissions. That's what the nerds like me call it. I think a better term for it is carbon dioxide removal. But we can run the global climate models and we can get an idea of approximately how much we need. And it's enormous. That little red star there sitting at something like between 5 and 10 tons of billion tons. Oh, tons, that would be nice. 5 and 10 billion tons of carbon removal that we need in the middle of the century in order to begin offsetting these emissions is twice the size of the global oil industry today. So by weight of material moved, we moved about 5 billion tons of oil a year. So this is a big lift, but this is the only thing that we know of that's going to get us to net zero. So we're going to have to do all that stuff up above. We're going to have to remediate all the emissions from our industry, all of our cars, and still clean up the air. Now, we like to think about these things on a global basis, like the graphs that I just showed you, and academics love this stuff. My apologies, Mark, if you're one of those. But they like to talk about carbon taxes. Well, carbon taxes are really good global things, but they don't tend to work locally. Somebody's getting cheated and somebody's making a bundle, and you know, on balance, it might be fine, but it's not a great thing individually. But frankly, that conversation is not driving momentum today. Businesses are what's driving momentum because a lot of businesses have net zero as their common goal. People ranging from Microsoft to Shell. And so when you have net zero as a business goal, you've got to deal with your own emissions, your suppliers, and your customers. It's very interesting that the majority of Microsoft's emissions today are from us right now running computers that use their products. They take credit for that electricity and they have to account for it. The only way they can do that is by removing those emissions from the atmosphere later because they can't control how you run your computer. But these specific pathways are going to be extremely important. And the thing that I like about it is that they have incentives, they have money, they have stockholders, they have a lot of things to bring to bear on making this actually happen. Well, here in California, we have a goal of reaching net zero by 2045. And the math for California turns out to be almost identical to that global math that I showed you. Only the Air Board has got a better plan than the whole world does. The whole world doesn't have much of a plan. But here in California, we have a plan. And basically, we're going to electrify everything. We're going to decarbonize industry. We're going to reduce, we're going to be more efficient with the energy that we use. And still, that brown line doesn't go to zero. The brown line hangs up somewhere around 80 to 100 million tons of emissions for all the same reasons that I already gave you for the global story. And so here in California, we're also going to have to subtract some emissions from the air if we want to be able to say that we're hitting net zero. At Livermore, we've estimated that if we had 125 million tons of capacity, that would make us comfortable that we could hit this net zero goal. And what that means is that our sources equal our sinks. And the sources on the left are all the things you might think of and natural and working lands. You probably don't think about the fact that California's farms and forests are emitting carbon right now. They're not absorbing it. So if we want to hit net zero, we have to have sinks that balance those sources. And we'd like to turn our natural and working lands into a sink instead of a source. And I'm going to talk about those three green things on the right next. These are basically the three ways that we can remove CO2 from the air. Natural solutions, makes sense, right? Biomass solutions, this will probably be a new one to you. I'll talk about basically using carbon that nature has already put into trees and agricultural products and using it, keeping it from going back into the atmosphere. And finally, direct air capture, building machines that do this job of cleaning up the atmosphere. Let's start with trees and soil. It's pretty obvious that trees are a great way to remove carbon dioxide from the soil, from the air. And soil also is maybe not as obvious, but soils are extremely rich in carbon. They have a gigantic capacity. And I'm going to put a graph up here of the amount of carbon that has been lost from the world's agricultural soils over history, over the time that we've been farming them. And everything that you see there in bright red has lost an enormous amount of carbon. Why did it lose it? From bad agricultural practices. We don't have cover crops, they've been plowed too much, crops have been, you have desertification happening. All of those things have led to 487 billion tons of carbon dioxide being lost from our worldwide farm soils. If we could put that back tomorrow, we'd be done. We wouldn't have to do anything else. There would be no climate crisis, but we can't. And we can't do it because it's too slow to put it back. So what's the issue around it being slow? The issue is that soil doesn't really store carbon. Carbon is a component of a living, healthy soil. And if you let that soil dry up or die, the carbon will evaporate or will basically leave the soil, carbon turn into carbon dioxide and enter the atmosphere. But we know that this is a great goal. If we can increase carbon in soil, we know that carbon-rich soil is great farm soil. The great soils of the Iowa plains are so healthy, are so rich because they have carbon put in there by the prairie grasses that were there before we started plowing them. So this is an important goal, but one that is not happening today very much in California. Trees are the thing you always hear about when you talk about how are we going to clean up the atmosphere? Let's grow some more trees. Good idea. These redwood trees over on Mount Tamalpais are just hitting their stride. They're about 40 years old. You can imagine a small tree doesn't remove much carbon. It takes a while for trees to really get to the point where they're really removing a lot. At this age, these trees are removing significant carbon from the atmosphere. And the good news about redwoods is they will continue to for their entire lifetime. Not only will they continue to remove it, they'll continue to remove more and more every year. Every time a tree gets bigger, a redwood tree removes more carbon. That's an unusual thing for forests. Most forests hit a period of senescence around a couple hundred years. You can imagine what a pine forest starts to look like as it gets very old. The trees start to die basically as fast as they're growing. But a lot of our forests in California are not susceptible to that. And the answer there is that an old forest is the best thing you could have. That's the thing that's absorbing the most possible carbon. But are trees really enough to do what we need? And there's a lot of flaws within them. Not flaws, they're challenges. And I'm not going to go into these in detail, but basically durability, suitability, is the land that the trees are growing on really a right place to grow forest? Leakage. And by leakage, I mean, is someone else cutting down their forest because we are growing forests? And additionality, basically, are you doing something new to change the climate from what the baseline is today? Glad to go into details on things like that in questions if you want to, but I just want to point out one real problem here in California with forests as a way to store carbon, and that we're burning them down too fast. In 2020, bad fire year, admittedly, our carbon emissions from our forest fires were much greater than our carbon emissions from our industry. And you could say that's biomass, it's natural carbon, but it's carbon in the atmosphere and it will never go away. It's adding to the baseline loading of carbon in the atmosphere that's just like any industrial emission. So we need to stop doing that if we're going to use forests as a way to protect carbon in the atmosphere. Second way that I want to talk about is taking advantage of the fact, as we just saw, that nature has absorbed a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Could we use that, use the products that we get from there, like timber and paper mills? Can we use that and not return all that carbon to the air as we normally do? And in California, forest waste is a great place to start. We are thinning forests in many places in California to reduce the wildfire hazard. Basically doing what you're seeing in this picture. We're taking out some of the small stuff, leaving the big trees, trying to get to that point that I showed you in the picture of the redwood trees, where we have only big trees, because big trees remove the most carbon. Even after you cut the small stuff out of here, the forest in a couple of years is going to be absorbing more carbon than it would have with all the small trees in there. So that's a great place to start. But what are we going to do with that wood that we remove from the forest? 15 million tons a year is what we hope to do in California. Well, it turns out that the carbon content of that wood is far more valuable than the energy content of it. These bags of wood chips here are 50% carbon by weight. That's an enormous reservoir of carbon. And if we let it rot or burn it, as almost all of that material is allowed to happen today, then that carbon just returns to the air. And so at Livermore, one of the things we've looked at is, can we keep that from going back to the air? The first thing we did to look at that question, I'll linger on this chart for a minute so you all have a chance to sort of find yourselves on it. We said, how much waste biomass is there in California? Let's add it all up. And we didn't put constraints on it in terms of the cost to collect it or what other uses might be put to today. We just said, what's the total? And it's huge, 58 million tons of biomass waste. Up in the northern state, you'll see most of that comes from forest and will come from forest management, like I just showed you, where we're thinning it. Green is basically ongoing use of the forests and sawmills and also shrub and chaparral management. Yellow, very important in the Fresno region. That's agricultural waste. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but we make 1 million tons of almond shells a year, 1 million tons. So there's a lot of agricultural waste. And then, not surprisingly, there's a lot of trash, particularly in Southern California. About 75% of the mass of our trash, the weight of our trash, is organic material. It's wood, paper, food, not supposed to be, but that is what's true today. And that organic material all contains carbon that was in the atmosphere very recently. If we kept it from going back into the atmosphere, as happens in a landfill today, then we'd be removing carbon from the atmosphere. So this is an enormous reservoir of waste material that we can use to basically, if you keep this carbon from going back to the air, then you're removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so this is a really valuable resource that we should think about how to engage it. And one of the most important things that we can do with this waste material in our studies we've discovered is to turn it into hydrogen. All of this biomass could be made into hydrogen, which separates the fuel, the hydrogen part, from the carbon, the CO2. Then you use the hydrogen for all the uses that we talked about a moment ago, and you put the CO2 permanently out of the atmosphere. Why would you want to do this? Let me walk you through a little evaluation of a thing called carbon intensity. If you have hydrogen, how much CO2 do you emit in making that hydrogen? Well, if we make it with electrolysis, so-called green hydrogen, it's basically zero if you have all renewable electricity. So you don't have any carbon footprint at all. But today, that's not true. Today, almost all of our hydrogen comes from processing natural gas, methane, and the CO2 is released from that processing. And we release about 7 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that we make. It's still relatively clean energy, but on a carbon basis, that's a lot of carbon. Well, companies have looked at how to make that better. companies like Airgas. And they've said, well, we can capture a lot of the CO2 from that processing at the plant and get that footprint down to about 3 kilograms. That's really good, more than 50% better. And they said, if we design new facilities that really are designed for that capture process, we can get it down to less than 1. We can get it down to really good. And this is the thing that people call blue hydrogen when you read about this in the literature. And blue hydrogen has some carbon emissions, but it's a lot better than the hydrogen that we make today. What about making hydrogen from biomass, like I suggested? Well, if we took the biogas that comes off of an anaerobic digester, either at a sewage plant or at one of the dairy farms that we see, that biogas that's coming off there, if we use that, we could end up removing 7 kilograms of hydrogen, of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that we make. So we have now a net negative, which means we're making hydrogen and cleaning up the air at the same time. If we go direct from biomass, instead of going through the anaerobic digester, for instance, with wood, like I showed you, then we can get down to 20 kilograms removed for every kilogram that we make. And now this gets to be a pretty significant benefit. So this is the kind of win-win that is going to be important for the state, for the evolution of our energy and climate system, is to be able to get double benefit. So we're making hydrogen that we clearly need. We're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we're not adding to the load on our electric grid. We're using this waste material that otherwise would rot or be burned in the state. When you talk to people in the Central Valley about this kind of process, the first question they always ask me is, what about the air emissions? Because they're all used to those plants on the left, the plants that burn biomass and make electricity for them, and they are nasty. Their emissions are not up to modern standards. And frankly, they're more than I think anyone would countenance out there. But if you convert the biomass in a closed system that adds oxygen, and a completely sealed system converts it into carbon dioxide and hydrogen, there are essentially no gaseous emissions at all. So now, today, have we built one of these things at full scale? No, we haven't. So these numbers on the right are from the design of a company called Moat, who designed one of these plants that they want to build in the Bakersfield area. And they've used numbers from some CEC, California Energy Commission studies of what the emissions from these should be. But at this point, the question for us is to say, can you actually do that? But once a company like Moat advertises that they can hit this kind of a level, then it's a really great lever for the rest of us to say yes. And if you can't hit that level, then you can't build that plant. But these are, I think, really remarkably clean levels that people are capable of hitting if we hold them to it. The third thing that we think about as a way to do this is perhaps the most straightforward. We just build a machine like this machine in Switzerland that is a chemical filter. It removes CO2 from the air and turns it into a liquid. Why are these machines getting so much attention today? Simply, it's that they solve the problem that is. There's too much CO2 in the air. Build a machine that cleans it up. Yes, the task is daunting, but it's straightforward. And frankly, there's so much that's complicated about the energy system. I can see why legislators have gravitated toward this as a system that they understand. And even though it's very expensive, you understand what you're going to get for it. And the deal seems straightforward. You pay for it, you get the thing you pay for. The question is, how much will you pay? And we've looked at this at Livermore. And there's two different styles of doing this today that are popular. There's one that's the one that I just showed you a picture of that runs on geothermal energy, that's from a company in Switzerland called Climeworks. And there's one that runs on natural gas. It removes all the carbon from the natural gas as well as the carbon from the air, from a company called Carbon Engineering, and they're in Brown. And they're both pretty expensive today. If you want, you can buy credits from Climeworks for removal, and you will pay $1,000 a ton for that. But they're getting their costs down fast. And this is our estimate of what costs will look like in the future as you start to deploy more and more units. And think of these units in sizes of millions of tons per year removed. By the time you get tens of millions of tons of capacity, the prices will come down dramatically, down here to something in the range of what most people are most of those businesses that I mentioned who are trying to hit net zero are gladly willing to pay today for carbon removal. But the investment to hit this point is daunting. Excuse me. Each of these facilities probably costs $1 billion a piece. And so to get to 30 million tons of capacity will take $30 billion of investment. And that's a big deal. So even though this is a very popular solution today, we still need to think about who worldwide is going to invest in getting that capacity. It's not all, that doesn't all have to be done in California. It has to be done around the world to get that learning curve, to understand how to build these things and to drive the costs of these down. So what's the bottom line on all this? We looked at all these things at Livermore and said, most of what you read in the literature is advocacy. There's somebody who likes a solution and then they explain to you why that solution is the good one and you don't need any of the other ones. Well, we don't think that's a very rational way to think about this, not a pragmatic way. So we said, what do we really need? What do all these things allow us to do? And let's just build a supply curve. Let's estimate what it's going to cost in 2045 and how much we could get from each in terms of capacity and cost. And this is the bottom line, that those three major options that I walked you through can provide the 125 million tons of removals that we think California would comfortably hit net zero with. If we had that much capacity, we're pretty comfortable we can hit net zero. Natural and working lands, if we can turn the corner on them and get them to the point where they're actually absorbing CO2 instead of emitting it, they will be the least expensive. And we think that we could get as much as 25 million tons a year if everything goes well. Well, we'd like everything on our natural lands to go well, so that's not irrational. But it's also not as large as a lot of people would like it to be, mainly because we've never deforested California. And so we can't reforest it the way they can in Tennessee or Maine. But 25 million tons a year is a lot, and it's a lot more than we're doing today. Today, in fact, we're losing something like 8 million tons per year, even regardless of the forest fire problem. The second thing, the biomass to the solution that I talked about, converting that biomass into hydrogen, we think is large for California. The capacity is very large. There's a lot of issues with the availability of that material, social issues associated with moving it around, but the capacity is very large and relatively inexpensive. And the final thing, direct air capture will be the most expensive, but you can basically build as much of it as you need if you're willing to pay for it. And so you can fill in the amount you need with those. And those three pillars can readily get us to net zero. But I'm a scientist. I like to know, okay, can you actually tell me the details on that? So we built a supply curve. We actually built a lot of supply curves that are based upon different kinds of technologies, but this was the one that has the lowest net cost. And the way this works is you start adding solutions into the supply curve with the least expensive ones first, and then you increase your volume as you increase the cost. So the natural solutions, which we think in California may cost as little as $11 a ton on average. And a lot of that is just doing a better job of managing our forests. You want to use those first at any rate. They have a lot of other benefits, but they'll only get us, as I said, 25 million tons. In the middle, in those things colored red, these are the solutions that start with biomass. And the least expensive of those is the trash, municipal solid waste. Why is trash the least expensive? Because it's already collected. You don't have to pay to move it around. It's already brought to a central location. You could convert that into hydrogen for about $29 a ton of CO2. That assumes that you sell the hydrogen for the current wholesale cost and get value for that. And that reduces the cost of the CO2 that you're now charging yourself for. Then you have a variety of other agricultural and forest solutions that get slightly more expensive. All of them are offset by the about $2 a kilogram that you pay wholesale for hydrogen today. By the way, if you bought it to put into your car, you'd be paying $14 a kilogram. So $2 a kilogram is a very conservative number. At the far end, you see those direct air capture plants, the two different kinds that I mentioned to you, which we think could, with adequate development, slip in under $200 a ton, but they're going to be always the most expensive solution that California ever reaches for. And so in our mind, you want to minimize that just to minimize the cost. But frankly, they also may not have other impacts that the other things do. And so we want to make sure that they're on the table. This is a thing that communities and regions could choose to do because it meets their needs. This total supply curve that I have here for 125 million tons would cost about $8 billion a year. That is a very, very low cost. Bear in mind that we were just doing opportunity to do this and the overall availability of material. We're not thinking about all the other social ramifications of doing these kinds of things. But the question in your mind was, who would pay for that? Well, it's in everyone's mind. And in a lot of cases, like with solar power, we think about the new option being cheaper than the alternative. Well, right now, the alternative is that we throw our trash into the air, but we don't throw our trash into the street. And so we pay someone to pick it up. And that's what's going to happen here too. We're going to have to pay to have CO2 removed from the atmosphere or not emitted to the atmosphere. The good news is at that $65 a ton, it's not that expensive. It's 0.3% of California's current GDP. The United States as a whole pays 1% of its GDP to pick up the trash, to waste management truck here, that you see here. In California, we think it's about 3 times that. It's a little hard to get your finger on the exact number, but we pay an enormous amount of money to have the environment we want with regard to solid trash, and we're going to have to do the same for CO2. What's going to happen to the CO2? Well, it's going to have to go back where it came from. Much of it's going to have to go back underground. You saw the natural solutions won't get us as much as we want. The good news is that CO2 is very similar to oil when it gets deep underground. It's the same viscosity, the same density. It can be stored in the same places. Rocks that hold oil for millions of years will hold CO2 for millions of years. And the really good news is the technology, the people, and the jobs are the same for putting that CO2 back underground. Geologic storage is also highly regulated, and we believe will be safe in places like California. California has the most strict regulations for geologic storage of anywhere in the world. The CO2 has to be stored at depths where it turns into a liquid more than 3,000 feet deep, typically between 5,000 and 10,000 feet deep, and well away from any drinking water or any other source of or anything you would worry about being contaminated by the CO2. I'm very comfortable that our regulations are strong in California. I'll tell you that a concern that the legislature has is who would actually enforce those regulations. And I think that's a discussion that we have to have. We did a study in Livermore of how many places are there like that. We just picked a couple of target areas where there's been significant oil and gas development. And why did we pick those areas? Because that's where the data is. We could actually evaluate how much capacity there is there because you have to share your well logs when you drill for oil in California. So we could go to those logs and look at them and say which ones meet all these regulations. And the sites in green are sites that meet all the existing regulations. Dark green means they far exceed the regulations. In yellow or orange, we think there's some issue associated with them that may or may not be resolved, but they're not immediately, it's not immediately obvious that they meet all the regulations. And in red are sites that simply don't meet the regulations. This is one of the most influential slides I've ever shown to audiences in my life, because people pick this up and they go, oh, I see where I could do this job, or, oh, nope, you can't do this. You know, there's just no way you can make those oil fields in Eastern Kern County work. They won't meet the regulations. And the good news is when we did this detailed study in just these 2 small areas, which do not include all the Central Valley, we could find 17 billion tons of safe storage, just these two areas. So it's more than we would need into the next 100 years of California for what I showed you for negative emissions. We're blessed with geologic storage in California. The Central Valley's carbon management sector needs to have an equitable approach. This is something we all recognize, that environmental justice, equity are major problems in the region, as they are really anywhere. But these are three takeaways that we have from thinking about this. First is that geologic storage will provide good jobs for the oil industry. As the oil industry declines, this industry can increase. They may not be the same size, but they'll at least be going in different directions. Agricultural resources today cause enormous air quality problems in the Central Valley. You see your air quality there, you're all familiar with that. Instead of burning it, converting it can improve air quality and also remove the material. Now, people talk about landfilling that material. It's still going to turn into CO2 and methane. Converting it will actually solve that problem instead of making it worse. And with livestock resources, diverting manure can, in addition to air, can improve water quality. So we think there are potentially significant benefits, environmental benefits, and job benefits for the Central Valley. But it's not that simple. I want to close with the three demons that keep us from getting to this rosy future that I've outlined for you. The first of these demons is timing. All the development that I've talked about, all the technology, all the supply chains that would be needed to do that cost money, and developing them will cost even more money. And there are people who will say we shouldn't spend, there are a lot of people who will say we shouldn't spend money on that now when we don't need it until 2050. We should spend money on renewables and efficiency right now. Well, that unfortunately doesn't reflect the magnitude of the job. As I said, we have to be something like twice the size of the world's oil industry by 2050. So it's going to take time to develop that, time to try these things out, time to see if that hydrogen company can really meet those air emissions goals that they said. We have to try all that stuff out. So timing is a real problem. And that's a demon, first demon that keeps us from getting there. Second demon is really of our own making. That is offsets. There are many companies who will look at the presentation I just gave and say, wow, Roger, if you can remove 10 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere a year, why can't you just make it 11 billion tons and let me continuing my business exactly the way it is? Well, there's a lot of reasons that we don't like that kind of answer, but simplest among them is that 10 billion tons is already unimaginably difficult. Adding another billion tons to it just makes it even harder, and almost certainly will be more expensive than any of the other ways that you could reduce carbon emissions. So it's not a get out of jail free card by any means. Finally, injustice. We're talking about large technical efforts, moving things around the state, building large facilities. And let's face it, that hasn't been good for communities in the past. And if we're not extremely attentive to it today, it's not going to be good for them in the future either. So that is a barrier that we're looking at to make sure that we don't screw it up this time. I like this picture because it reflects the California future that I imagine, where we work together to solve problems. And we're going to need the big tent because we have a lot of problems to solve, and we're going to need a lot of approaches to solving those problems. We can't afford to say, I've got the perfect solution, the rest of you don't count. We can't afford to say my problem's bigger than your problem, even though that may be true. We are going to have to solve a lot of problems simultaneously. And so I encourage you all to embrace all the technologies and approaches that are necessary to fully decarbonize the economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. You've inspired questions already. So let's kind of get to them. First question. Are you talking, let me see here, just lost it. Let's see. Are you talking about producing hydrogen for fuel cells for most transportation needs?
It certainly could be. And that is the early market for doing it because the economics simply look better on that.
Okay. And Felina, I'll get to you in a second. I'm gonna go through these questions first, and then I will get to you. Okay. Lisa Bryant, one of our professors of political science, has a question here. She said, what percentage of businesses currently have a net zero goal? What is being done to increase buy-in by other companies? We'll start with that first.
If I can be a little crude, I think the answer is what percentage of companies don't have a bullshit net zero goal. There's an enormous number of them that recognize that, they're going to need to do this, and they've made pronouncements about it. Relatively few that have what I consider to be well thought out goals, but there's 1,100 global corporations that have net zero goals. Last time I checked, which is about 6 months ago, it's become the fashionable thing to do. And I think the great thing about that is that now allows stockholders and the rest of us to hold their feet to the fire. Like, you said you were going to net zero. Tell me what you're doing about it. What's your plan? How are you going to get there? I don't like your plan. Shell published a plan. I think Shell, by the way, is doing an enormously good job of doing this as oil companies go. But they published a plan that said all we have to do is plant trees the size of Brazil. Like, that's not a plan. Anyway, but I don't have an answer for percentage now, but it's growing. And certainly here in California, my experience is that almost all large corporations have a net zero goal.
Right. She also asks, what is the current state of public, that's federal, state, and or local government and private partnerships for reducing carbon emissions?
They're good and about to get better with the infrastructure bill. The material that I've just described to you has about $12 billion associated with it in the infrastructure bill. California will be remiss if we don't harvest a whole bunch of that. So those public-private partnerships are really ready to go. But I'll have to say that during the last administration, nothing happened in that space, and it was all driven by business and industry. The good news is there was enormous interest in there, and 5 companies, Microsoft, Shopify, McKinsey, who were the others, a couple others, just announced that they were going to buy $950 million worth of credits over the next 8 years without considering the price. They're going to spend that much money on it rather than looking at how many tons of CO2 they're doing, because they recognize they need to create a market. That's the kind of thing that's really going to drive markets.
We have another question from Dale. Has geological storage of CO2 been demonstrated in the Central Valley?
Not yet. The Department of Energy started 20 years ago working on this topic. That's what got me into carbon management, was working on this, and developed 6 regional partnerships around the country. 5 of those regional partnerships were extremely successful and put 14 million tons of CO2 underground in experimental programs that showed it was safe and effective to do. The California partnership unraveled and never put any CO2 underground, not for technical reasons, but because it was badly run. I'm sorry, did I say that in my out loud voice? I did. And so, technically, this is one of the best places in the world to do it, but people can't go around and see one of these things. And that really hurts, because you'd like to just walk up and see them. The answer is an injection well to put CO2 underground would fit in my office here. You wouldn't even know it was there. It's smaller than a gas well. So, unfortunately, though, we'd have to go to Louisiana or Mississippi or Illinois to see those operating today.
By the way, I just want to let you know, Roger, that we've already got someone, Glenda said, great presentation. Thanks, Glenda, for saying that. So Felina, you're up.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us today. I work for Era Energy, which is an oil company. And on behalf of California Oil, we are your biggest cheerleaders for carbon capture. Where we are for my colleagues in the room is we're working with CalGEM to try to figure out how to permit these projects so that we can have them. We want to capture the carbon and put it back into the reservoir. And that will take all of us to retirement, I hope. But I want to reflect, Mr. Aines, on your statement about the sunset of the oil age and how oil is in decline. I just wish to politely remind you that as we've tried to pivot to EVs, 50% of that vehicle is made from fossil fuels, in addition to 6,000 other byproducts that are out there. So I hope that you can see a future for our company to be both an oil producer as well as very busy in carbon capture.
I think this points out the kind of standards that we should expect of the fossil industry into the future is, first of all, that they recognize these problems and that they're taking action on these problems. ERA has been proactive in that, doesn't have a project yet, I will point out to you. This was a thing that I think it's reasonable for the rest of us to ask you to be aggressive about this. You're emitting the carbon now and you should be putting it underground. The challenge with being aggressive is that remember I told you that California had the strictest standards. Well, California and the federal government have these, and the federal government standard for the permit to put that CO2 underground currently takes at least 2 years to get a permit, and realistically it's taking more than that. And so there's, I believe, about 10 projects in California that are in the process of applying for one of those permits, and it won't happen for years. That's a real challenge. I would like to see that happen faster.
I'm going to ask you this question. Pete, I'll get you next, but there was one question that just came in, and I'll let you answer. We've got a wide range of folks here, and one person asking, basically, if you have any funding, if Lawrence Livermore Lab receives any funding from fossil fuel corporations like Koch Industries.
We work with everyone. We work from NGOs, from Climate Works and Hewlett, and we do have a partnership with Total, the French oil company, to work on converting CO2 into ethylene. That's a big effort for us, is to learn how to make ethylene from CO2 instead of from fossil fuel, which Total shares. We also have a project on soil carbon with Exxon. The great majority of we spend about $80 million a year on this. The great majority of that comes from the federal government, state government, and foundations.
All right, thank you, Roger. Peter, what's your question?
Hey, Roger, good to see you. By the way, Roger and I both participated and delivered a poll done last year in September. Roger's one of the experts. Terrific project. And by the way, Roger, terrific presentation as well today. My question is this: we're getting, this in some senses is getting harder rather than easier, because there's all the issues associated with timing of this, right? And so permitting is extraordinarily difficult in California. It's even more difficult when it involves EJ concerns, which are legitimate concerns, as you alluded to in your presentation, but they tend to delay the starting point for sometimes years on end. In addition to that, we now have the issue of people bordering on revolting over the price of energy, for them, whether it's fuel or electricity. So how would this, in particular, if you're looking at biomass and production of hydrogen from biomass, is that in the near to medium term, is that going to exacerbate the cost of that people have to pay for their energy?
First I'll caution you that you don't want to ask people like me about the costs of doing business. We have irrational responses to things, but we do our best to run the numbers on those things. And the answer that we see is that things like that hydrogen conversion option, you get two benefits for the cost of one facility. And so it reduces the cost of both of those outcomes. I think realistically that we're just going to have to build some of those things at full scale and see how those costs play out. Sometimes it's better than you expect, sometimes it's worse than you expect, but I have to say that right now those are just our estimates. But we think the estimates, encourage us to go forward.
I'm just wondering, Roger, are there any pilot projects or demonstration projects planned or thought of for Kern County?
There absolutely are. Kern County is moving forward aggressively. The plan there is to think about where you do this kind of work and try to permit a big swath, like a 10 square mile business park. Lorelei Oviatt who's the head of planning there, thinks that would be a practical way to do this, where you have geologic storage under the site, you have businesses permitted to do that on the surface, and they have agricultural land that they're going to have to take out of service there because they can't get water anymore. And so it looks like a win-win for them to do that. And that's the current thought process. I'd say it's not a plan yet.
Okay, going in that direction. Beth has got a question for us.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great presentation. I'm curious, in California, so I'm a faculty at Fresno State, and one of the things I'm really curious about in water is SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management. And I saw that there was the regional climate collaboratives and the transformational climate things that the state has. And I'm curious, so it seems to me like the carbon is a bit different than the water, but here's this push for these regional climate collaboratives, almost like the SGMA kind of groundwater management agencies, not to say it's the same, but I'm curious, in your opinion, is the Transformation Climate Collaborative and the regional climate collaboratives, are those enough to support that kind of sustainability, that net neutral negative zero that we're looking for, or is there additional funding and initiatives that would be needed?
I think we've only just scratched the surface on what's needed for that kind of thing. We're talking about changing the entire economy of California. About, the governor has announced he would like to manage 30% of the state's lands for carbon benefit. These are enormous changes, and I think we're just starting to think about what that means.
Daniel, go ahead.
Sure, and thank you again for the presentation, and thanks to the Maddy Institute for putting this together. So I was just kind of curious. I work in agriculture, and I know we're going to have a lot of fallow ground here, because of SGMA. Are there any solutions that you can see for that ground? You mentioned, Kern County was kind of working on something like that, but in terms of like cover cropping or any of those kinds of solutions, is there anything there that agriculture could maybe help with the solution, but maybe put some of those fallow grounds to a good use there?
We're really interested in that. I think you're going to need to have the state's strong agricultural research interests, particularly UC Davis, engaged in that. But one of the things that we like a lot is the idea of perennial plants instead of annual plants. And they may not do exactly the same service, but they're also much more water conserving. And so you still need some water, but you can share the water better with those kinds of plants. And they're also putting carbon deep into the soil where it stays permanently. So we like that idea a lot. We think the state needs to go out and demonstrate this, try these things out, and these are not trivial things. These are 100-acre, demonstrations. You probably need 20 of those just to even know if it was worth moving forward. So we'd really like to see the state do that. And the second thing, and this is kind of, the Lorelei Oviatt's fallback position is, what if we just use that fallow land underneath it to store for geologic storage and let those landowners still obtain value from their land?
Appreciate it.
Yeah, Daniel, as you were talking, I was looking at I got to read the report. Thank you, Roger. It was a lot of fun. Stick to the executive summary. Anyway,
everyone does. That's fair.
Daniel, if you take a look, if you go online, you can check out their report. If you need, I can send you a link. But on chapter 2, they talk about the natural solutions, and in there some stuff on what ag can do. So I think it is a possible solution there, but a lot of good information as well. We are running up against the deadline here, but I don't see any other questions. But I do want to ask one last one because I was saving it for the end, Lisa, because I thought it was such a great ending question. So I'll leave you with this last question, Roger, if you could answer this. And it's basically thinking about things globally, but acting locally. So she says, at the individual level, changes that we can make that are the best changes in our daily lives to really help address this problem.
Well, I think you want to imagine how can you use less fossil fuels. That's the thing that we're doing today. And so this is things like making, when you have the opportunity to buy an electric car, do it, but using electricity in more efficient ways. I have a natural gas range, and I've been testing out these inductive cooktops, and I'm like, wow, they're really pretty good. I was not expecting that. I'm rather in love with my gas range. But I think thinking about things like that are important. But the problem is not individually. The problem is globally and regionally. And so it's very important to talk about these things, to talk about how your community can react to this problem and what the things that your community can bring to it that makes sense for you. We're having a debate here in Livermore about whether we should build large-scale solar facilities in the lands around Livermore. Well, that's a kind of debate that every community needs to have. What are you going to contribute? What are you going to not contribute? What are you going to say that's out of bounds for our world? And so I think having that conversation is really important. And it's hard today when you get together with your friends, you want to talk about Ukraine or you want to talk about COVID and you don't get around to climate, but we're going to have to do that.
Well, that is, Roger, fantastic advice and a great presentation. I want to just follow up what everybody else said. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Thanks, everyone. You know, there's nothing bad about leaving a few minutes early. We always like meetings that end a little early. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll be having webinars. Probably the next one will probably be in the early fall, but who knows, maybe this summer. We'll see what happens. Anyway, have a great rest of the week, you guys. Nice seeing you.
Thank you all.